Econ students, happy snow day and welcome back to AP Macro Lesson 3, Price Level and Inflation. So today we're going to talk about this idea of inflation, or when there's a growth in the overall level of prices, so prices are rising and money doesn't hold as much weight. And we can compare that to the opposite effect of deflation, where if there was a decline in prices, so money had an even heavier weight. And so the most extreme form of hyperinflation, or why do we even care about learning about inflation, is that it can have extremely negative impacts on a society. So hyperinflation, when there's an extreme rise in prices, depicted here in Zimbabwe, this man, even though he has very high currency, a lot of hypothetical, he's rich, he has all this money, it would cost him 16 million Zimbabwe dollars to actually get bread. So even though he's a billionaire, he is starving. So we have these questions of how do we measure inflation, what causes inflation, and what are the actual impacts of inflation. So flashing back to our first video, we vaguely referenced inflation, talking about calculating real GDP. So instead of having nominal GDP, so just the C and I and G and NX of one specific year, we want to adjust for inflation to then be able to compare all these different GDPs of different years. And so when we're calculating GDP, we would divide nominal GDP by the price level, by this price index that's used to deflate, or we would use the GDP deflator, the price level, to adjust for GDP. So now we're actually figuring out what is that price level, how do we calculate a price index, what does that mean? So if we want to calculate consumer price index, so that's based on the actual consumption of consumers, that's calculated by research done, at least in the US, by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And so there's all these surveys that are done saying what do people buy in a year, how much money do people buy in different items in a year, and what are those prices of those different items. They create a typical basket. So maybe if I go to Carrefour and I'm always buying a certain amount of vegetables every year, if I go buy certain clothing items every year, so we create a typical basket for the consumers of a whole country. Again, we're thinking macro, not just micro, not my individual Miss Haley's typical basket, but what might be a typical basket of all Jordanians. So to calculate consumer price index, so we're looking at what is the consumption of a typical person, but not just looking at those items, seeing how those prices of that consumption might be in this current year compared to other years, and then converting to an index number. So we can walk away saying that the CPI for 2018 was 150. And we're going to see in the next slide what that number actually means. So for a price index, the calculation, we take the basket price, so saying of all these typical items consumed, they cost this much in this year. And we divide it by all those same items. They might cost a different amount in the base year, or the year that we're comparing to deflate those prices. And we also multiply it by 100. So in a very simplified calculation, let's say that in a year, this consumer is just buying socks, notebooks, and pencils. And what I've chosen are years that, for many of you, you were a freshman or sophomore and then junior at King's. So let's say as a freshman, you're only buying socks, notebooks, and pencils. If this is your typical basket, the total basket for the year 2016 would be $16. And so now what we're looking at, we're keeping that same number of basket items, the same kinds of basket items, but what we're seeing is that there's an increase in prices. And so now, instead of saying that all of the items cost $16, now in that same year, or a different year in 2017, those same items are now costing much more. So we start to see an increase in prices, which we now know is inflation. So we also want to compare it to now you're a junior, you still need socks, notebooks, and pencils. That's still your typical basket, but prices have changed again. So they're higher than 2016, but they've decreased from 2017. So we now see that the overall basket for the year 2018 was $19.50. So we can predict that there is inflation and then a little bit of deflation, but if we're comparing it back to that base year, how much inflation actually occurred? So how do we use these numbers to then plug into our price index calculation? So for CPI for this year, we would take 16 divided by 16. So why are we just taking the same numbers divided by each other? Because if we've chosen 2016 as the base year, that we want to compare all of the prices to this first year, we would just take that 2016 basket price divided by itself. And so the CPI for 2016 is 100. And you can always know if the CPI is 100, that is the base year, because we're just comparing those same prices to themselves. And so then for CPI of 2017, we're going to take the new basket price, so 2050, and we're dividing it by 16 times 100. So we're going to see a larger number than a number that's larger than 100. We're going to see 128.13. And so what you all can see is that if we're comparing this CPI to the base year, the 28, that's the percent of inflation. If we're comparing to the base year, 2017 saw 28% inflation from those base year prices. And then with CPI of 2018, what we do here is just take that total basket of 2018, 1950, divided by 16 times 100. And so the CPI of 2018 would be 121.88 CPI. So see, the CPI of 2018 was lower than 2017, but still higher than the base year. So there was inflation compared to the base year for both 2017 and 2018, but just one year had more severe inflation. So what do we actually do with these numbers to get a specific inflation rate? Because I showed you all, if we're always comparing back to the base year, we just look at the difference between 100. So the inflation from 2016 to 2017 was a 28%, and the inflation from 2016 to 2018 was 21%. But what if we wanted to find the difference in inflation between 2017 and 2018? So not going back to that base year, comparing two different years. So that's just a very simple percent change calculation. So we're just saying the percent change in prices over a specific time period. So assume that the CPI for year 1 is 100, and the CPI for year 2 is 125. So which is the base year? We know that the year 1 is the base year because the CPI is 100, because that means that we're dividing the basket price of the same year against its own year. So since we know that this is a base year, and then looking at the next year, we can predict that the percent of inflation is going to be 25%. But how we would officially calculate that, we would just take the new year minus the old over the old. So we take 125 minus 100 divided by 100 and then multiply it by 100. So what we get there is 25%, which we had predicted. There was going to be 25% inflation rate between this year 1 and this year 2. But now, in the second calculation, neither of these years are the base year because we have 125 as CPI and 150 as CPI. So you could predict that there would be a 25% inflation, but knowing how to fully calculate percent changes, you would say, no, Miss Haley, you are incorrect because we're taking that new year minus the old year divided by the old year. And so even though 150 minus 125 is still 25, we'd be dividing it not by 100. So let's see. So we take 150 minus 125, that would be the numerator of our percent change to calculate inflation, and we divide it again by that new year, which is 125. So in this situation, the inflation rate would be 20%. So even though the numerical difference between 150 and 125 is still 25, because we're dividing by that first year, the inflation rate between those two is actually lower than the first. So what is the cause of inflation? We started to see how we can calculate it, and before we started to see how it relates to our lives, but how is it actually, or how is it actually caused? So we have this equation. We have this connection between money supply, so how much actual physical dollars or dinars are out into the world, velocity of money, so how quickly is a dinar taken from you to a shawarma shop, to a city mall, to a bank? How is that money actually moving in the economy? So those two variables are in a direct relationship between P, which is the price level, which we just calculated. So price level is this measurement of increasing prices over different years, and Y, which we know is real GDP. And so connecting these ideas, we know that if there's an increase of money in the economy, so let's say the government starts printing a lot of more currency, and so you have more money in your hands as a consumer, that there is going to be an increase in price level. Because there's this argument that if there's more money in the economy, people are going to spend that money more, and so the price level will increase. So why might a government actually increase the money supply? Because there are, as we saw in our first image, there's these negative aspects of hyperinflation. If there's so much increase in prices, the currency doesn't actually hold that much weight anymore, and so you can't buy the items you used to buy. So why is the government often encouraged to raise this money supply? Well, there's two often solutions or reasons why they might do this. So it's government debts, that if the government needs to pay back a lot of money really quickly, that if they increase the money supply, they can use that freshly minted currency to pay off debts. And two, there's a temporary stimulation of the economy. Again, let's say your parents are like, oh, we're going to increase your allowance, you get a lot of money. You might immediately say, oh, I'm going to use this money to go out and get food, go to the movies, spend time with my friends. But in the long run, this effect of the government increasing the money supply actually has many negative consequences. So what I'm going to do in the next video, which will be short and we'll watch in the middle of the week, is just a blitz video of what certain problems but also benefits come from inflation. So thank you for watching today's video, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your snow day.